that better? That's certainly better for that as a science.
Yes, we were able to. Yes, we had an excellent conversation.
Good, good, because I told him he should talk to you.
There's we met with him like I and Shorter Seconds met with him and she works at the Museum of Life and Science Institute. So there's like we went there and we got like a good discussion going. And after I visited, I plan on being able to share. I plan on like reaching out to them again to like establish
Good.
things. So.
Yeah, because he was saying, how do I get in touch with, you know, the representative to get them more involved? And I said, well, start with science. So I'm glad he followed up with you.
A nicer time and a time to chat. They had a lot of good ideas and I think they've been awesome.
Good.
Oh, it's coming through.
Okay,
cool.
Yeah.
It said reconnecting.
They give you a lot more.
There's always a delay. And you're connected via Wi-Fi. You want to obviously make sure you're connected via Wi-Fi.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure.
You should definitely go back and see, they've added so much to the outdoor part, you know, like 25 years ago when I first started, they're not called that, a couple of outdoor things. The outdoor part is just exploded, there's so much more, so it's really cool.
I'm still doing eye drops twice a day. So before bedtime and once in the morning when I wake up. And it's still stuck together sometimes. I'm mildly
Hey,
passive on
you wanted that thing last night, right? Okay, I was gonna say, I recognize it.
How'd you do last night?
I didn't get shot.
Almost.
Cool, I'm glad it worked out, so.
Thank you for introducing us.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay.
Story that is reactive.
Good, yeah, I feel like sometimes you know, part of my job.
Oh, I know. They're so bad.
That background.
That's what the doctor does.
Now you have a wonderful story to reproach your daughter.
They always gave me like,
Enough said. All you gotta do is finish.
Yeah.
And then you finally go to Hawaii.
I have like a
I've already
list
committed my
of
kids
getting
to
punched in the face, you know?
registration.
Oh,
Say,
oh, you're ready to go again, right? He said, yeah. He said,
the
"Where is
places
it?"
you need, do not need.
So.
Yeah, I mean, it seems only reasonable, given that. Yeah. Yeah. Good thing.
When you're back. Okay.
Is it because they're scared of you or they just want to be close to the pizza? Maybe a couple of my ones in the front row and that's all questions.
Scheduled last, like right now, like we're going now, we're live.
not on the curriculum.
Yes, that's great.
The I am SciComm Twitter feed right now is actually doing, like, it's a man who does science. So the
Oh,
whole thing
perfect.
is a different science. That's not
Good.
Thank you.
Oh, cool.
Up front.
There's leftover ends from yesterday's event in the fridge. If you want some of that.
Okay.
I think I should order them.
Yeah, just kind of those ones.
Noon straight up. Hi, Noon. Want me to go ahead and start? All right. Well, welcome everybody. We're really pleased you could make it today. It's high noon, so we will start. You probably smelled the pizza already. If you haven't availed yourself of that, there's plenty of it. So help yourself to pizza and drink in the back. My name is Dory Weintraub, and I work here at the Initiative for Science and Society. I'm the Science Communication Director with the Science and Society Initiative. And we are really excited because this is the first ever SciComm Lunch and Learn event. This is a series that we've been talking about doing and I've wanted to organize for a really long time. And I just have not had the capacity to do it on top of everything else that we have going on. And so we have been really fortunate recently to have a new postdoc join us, Dr. Ariana Eily. And one of the first things we put her to work on was getting the series set up and making her be the first presenter as well. So she's not only going to be helping me run the series, but is the inaugural speaker in the SciComm Lunch and Learn series. The idea for the series is to be very informal. It's just an opportunity to pull together anyone on campus, undergrad, grad student, postdoc, faculty, staff, anybody who's interested in any aspect of science communication. And get together once a month. We'll probably take the summers off, but throughout the school year, we'll do once a month. Get together and just explore some interesting aspect of science communication. Sometimes it may be veering a little bit more towards science outreach or public science engagement, or maybe a little bit more research focused. We really don't know. We're going to be pretty opportunistic about who participates in the series, and just explore topics of interest. We really want this to be an informal, casual series, so we're asking all of the presenters to sort of think of it as a science cafe type of format where they talk for maybe 15 minutes to a half hour, maybe a little bit longer, but leave ample time for Q&A and opportunities for the audience to get engaged in the conversation and ask questions and contribute. So please feel free to do that. I will, as I said, this is the first one that we've done, and we're really, really pleased with the wonderful turnout for the first time ever. My hope is that down the road, we will outgrow this room, and we'll have so many people interested in these that we have to get a 500-person auditorium for them. But this is a great group for the first one, so welcome to all of you, and thank you for being here. I do want to mention that I said we're being opportunistic about how we set these up. So it's not going to be a set date and time. We'll plan to do once a month, but it's going to be a bit flexible. And for example, turns out that next month, in March, on March 19th, a colleague and friend of mine is going to be visiting here from the University of Utah, and she sent me an email and said, I'm going to be here and I'd love to visit while I'm on campus at Duke. And I said, how about, don't just visit, how about I put you to work? Her name is Nalini Nadkarni. She has done incredible, amazing work with communicating science to underserved audiences, in particular prison audiences. So she's got a whole website where she describes all this amazing work she's done with bringing science to incarcerated populations and getting them, not only talking about science with them, but getting engaged in sort of a citizen science aspect of it and getting prisoners to actually be part of her research program. So she's an amazing person, has lots of great stories to tell. So definitely circle that one in your calendar. It'll be the same time, noon to 1 p.m. on Tuesday, March 19th. And if you're not already on the Science and Society listserv, William, what do they need to do? Just go to scienceandsociety.org and sign up for our listserv. You'll be on our mailing list, and then you'll learn about all the new events that we have coming up. We also have a great talk lined up for April, but I won't get ahead of ourselves because I want to give Ariana plenty of time to talk about her work. So, as I said, Ariana Eily, Dr. Ariana Eily, has just joined us recently as a postdoc. She completed her graduate work here at Duke about, 3 weeks ago? You defended? And immediately we put her to work as a postdoc, and we're delighted to have her. Her graduate work was in the biology department, where she was focusing on plant biology, but she has made the decision to sort of transition her career away from the lab bench and into focusing on science communication, and specifically on the interface of art and science. And so this was a great opportunity for her, I hope, to come do a postdoc with us, and certainly a great opportunity for us to have her and bring her energy and her ideas and enthusiasm to the group. So we're delighted to have her as our inaugural Lunch and Learn speaker, and she's going to be telling about an amazing project that she organized last year with a couple other grad students here. So thank you for being here, and Ariana, take it away.
So yeah, my goal is going to be to kind of talk about this project that me and two other graduate students, Casey Lindberg and Hannah Devens, launched last summer that we're getting ready to do kind of the second iteration of this summer. And I want to kind of get to a point where we're all kind of discussing the intersection between art and science and how we can bring them together. So hopefully it won't be me talking this whole time, but I want to hear from you all too. But traditionally, when we think of like scientists and we think of artists, we tend to kind of think of it in this kind of bimodal way, right? Where we have scientists who are really analytical, fact-driven, et cetera, and then artists that are the more creative types. And so to kind of set the stage for this, I want to play a little game where we're going to go through a series of photos, and I want you to tell me if you like think it's a scientist or you think it's an artist who created it. So, and I forgot that I had animation on this. So, picture one. Raise your hand if you think it's an artist. 3. Raise your hand if you think it's a scientist. Yeah. So this is actually a screen print by a biology professor at UNC Chapel Hill named Bob Goldstein. He took up screen printing as a hobby, and now for different scientific talks, he actually makes science-like posters for those talks that are more eye-catching and draws attention rather than the way that traditional science talk posters are, where it's like the face of a person who's talking and then some long, complicated title. And so he actually was a part of our exhibit last year, and he provided us with a whole entire wall of his screen prints for different scientific talks. It kind of ended up being the face of the exhibit. So, there we go. Next one. How many of you think it's an artist?
Sure.
How many of you think it's a scientist? So this one is actually an artist. So this was an MA student who works with a science lab. I'm blanking on which school they're at now, but they formed a collaborative kind of project where they had these MA students working with these scientists who were looking at the surfaces of different biofilms, or like when you have a lot of bacteria that are growing like collectively in a group. And so they made these kind of images playing with the surface diagrams or surface microscopy that they did on those biofilms. So what about this next one? How many of you think artist? The bulk of the room? Yeah?
What about both?
Both, yeah.
Yeah. So any guesses on who this actually is?
Leonardo.
Exactly. So we also have folks who can be both, who are brilliant artists, but that are also brilliant scientists. And actually at UNC, at the Auckland Art Museum, they have art exhibit up going right now that is similarly about kind of the artistry behind the godfather of neuroscience. And so you do have these individuals that kind of straddle both of these dynamics and are really brilliant in both of these fields. so, me and 2 other graduate students last year, we formed a science communication committee for a student group that we were part of. And as part of that, we did a handful of different outreach events. So some of them were things like, Sips in Science, where we took scientists, we trained them to communicate about their work, and then we kind of ran it at like a local bar like Speed Dating with Work, where they're paired with somebody from the community. They have a minute maybe to talk about the work that they do, and then they're just talking conversationally about their work with this, other person. But we wanted to do something bigger. We were kind of racking our brains for different ways that we could really push the boundaries of how we were communicating our scientists and working with scientists to communicate their work. And so through a series of kind of tossing around ideas and some subtle miscommunications, we actually came up with this idea for this art exhibit. So we called it the Art of a Scientist. And what we did here is we took scientists and we took artists and we actually paired them together to make collaborations to come up with artistic pieces that were inspired by the scientist's work. And so we actually ended up with kind of 3 different categories of people who were part of the exhibit. We had our, scientists and artists pairs that were together. Then we had some scientists who are also artists who chose to be an artist either for themselves or for another scientist in the exhibit. And then through talking with our different artists, we actually learned that a handful of them were former scientists who have now transitioned into doing art full time. And so it was a really interesting kind of spectrum of people that we got to work and interact with as we were doing this. And kind of the main goals that we had here were, for one, to find a way to engage the Duke community, but also the Durham community in discussions about science and about art, kind of coming together. And then 2, we wanted to get these 2 groups of individuals, scientists and artists, which sometimes we have a really hard time bringing them together. We wanted to get them to work together in a really kind of purposeful way by working on these projects. And then 3, we wanted to kind of open up a dialogue about the things that we get by merging art and science together. And so in planning the exhibit and planning the things that we did with the exhibit, we kind of wanted to keep that thread of those 3 goals in mind along the way. And so, like I said, we had scientists that we paired with artists, and these are 2 examples of the pairs that we had. And so we exhibited the scientist piece that they had, as well as the artist piece that the artists came up with as a part of that collaboration. And the dialogue kind of between the scientists and the artists were up to them. They could talk as much or as little as they wanted to. Jim Lee, the artist in that far picture, he actually went and visited Jessica's lab, and he learned about how she collected her samples and then used that as a means of framing his piece, and actually used pieces that he borrowed from her lab to actually create that. So it was really a deeper kind of collaboration between those 2 partners. And then Jonah and Erica Hamilton. So Jonah is in the neurobiology department, and he studies the neurocircuitry for how brains produce song. And so he had a video of all these neurons firing in a pattern. And then Erica kind of took that inspiration, and she used a type of collage where you embed things in wax. And she actually had kind of formed it together to copy the neuro pattern that was firing in that video that Jonah had. So they came up with some really interesting ways of drawing inspiration and kind of fusing those 2 aspects together. And then, there we go. We also had scientists who served as artists. So we had a pathology student, she's now graduated, and she kind of took things that traditionally the pathology department, or pathology departments in general, used to teach their students about different pathologies. And then she did the kind of classic stereotypical still life of a fruit basket, drawing inspiration from her own field. And then we had another student, Angelo Marino, who screen prints, kind of similar to what Bob does. And so he made screen prints that were based on the RNA structures that he uses to develop drug treatments. And so we had some really kind of creative takes, and it was awesome to let people kind of come up with what they were doing on their own and use things that they're inspired by or that they do on their own, and kind of showcase those skill sets. But then, as I said before, the other thing that we wanted to do, yes, it's great to have all of these pieces and all of these neat ideas in one place, but you also need to facilitate people coming through that exhibit and actually interacting with not just the pieces, but also the people who created the pieces. And so we were really deliberate in kind of planning how people, like the ways that we drew people into the exhibit over the summer. And then we also got the benefit of having kind of bonus ways that people came through. And so one of the things that we did to kind of improve that interaction, each of the pieces that we had, both the scientific image and the artist piece, had kind of fuller descriptions that either explained the science behind the piece, or if the artist chose to kind of explain the work that the artist did a little bit in more detail. And so we made a website and then put QR codes by each of the pieces so that if you wanted to learn more about that piece, you could actually pull it up on your phone and get a more detailed take of what it was that went into this piece that you've now been fascinated by. And one of the very first things we did, I might have turned this off on accident, was to hold an opening reception. So we had this moment where I think we all had a little bit of that panic of what if nobody comes through this. And for our opening reception, we actually had over like 250 people come through. And we got a lot of support from this from the Rubenstein Art Center. They gave us the space and they were kind of really excited about having this being a part of that space. But we had a really good turnout and people were really kind of fascinated by this idea of bringing science and art together in this way. And so we had both the scientists and the artists at the gallery opening, and we actually let them come through first so they could see all of their pieces. And it was interesting, some of the pairs that hadn't gotten a chance to actually meet in person, they were really excited about actually having that opportunity to meet one another. And we had some friendships between the scientists and artists that were collaborating, develop, and kind of be things that are lasting and persisting now. But we had those individuals there and gave them name tags so that as different people were walking through the exhibit, they actually could meet and talk to and interact with the people who created the pieces that they were looking at, which was also a really great kind of opportunity to like get dialogue out. We also ran a couple of different tours of the exhibit with different groups. So we did a tour with the Science Communicators of North Carolina where they brought their people in and we had a couple of the scientists and artists that made pieces while we were going through the tour kind of give their story of the piece. That's another thing to have the actual creator of the piece be able to tell you the story behind how they were creating it. And in this photo here, so a woman in a striped shirt named Molly, who she had a really kind of personal and detailed story about how she took inspiration from a scientific piece, which was a pulsar reading of heartbeats. And having her be able to share that and you be able to see the human side of the kind of mathematical approach that was used to create that scientific image was a really powerful thing. So it was awesome to have those individuals really be able to share themselves to different people coming through. We also did a set of family days, so not only do we want to kind of attract adults through the exhibit, but we also wanted to get kids coming through there too. So we did a series of different activities that were aimed more at younger kids and their parents. So we did a series on 3D printing, which was actually a big hit, and we had a scientist, a graduate student here who does 3D printing as a main fixture of his kind of own work and his own enjoyment. Lead that workshop and be able to share that with younger kids. And we also had a handful of activities that we got through collaborations with different companies in the area. So Carolina Biological gave us activities for a public outreach activity they have called Maggot Michelangelo, where they use it to kind of teach kids about animal physiology or kind of the beginnings of it by using larvae and teaching them how they kind of twitch and move and roll, and dyeing them in kid-friendly finger paints, and then putting them on white pieces of paper and just letting them move. And so it was awesome just like contacting them and being like, we have this exhibit and we want to be able to draw kids in and give them hands-on activities. And they provided us with all the materials and actually sent people out to be a part of that too. We also had folks from Nikon come through and help us. So they brought through one of their microscopes and a set of samples that we hooked up in the Ruby. And then we had them show different slides. and we had kids talk about what they were seeing scientifically and then draw their own versions of it to kind of get them in that process of like combining both science and art for themselves. And then, as I said before, we had a graduate student share 3D printing and the different aspects of 3D printing that come together. And one of the other things we found out through some of the different kind of talks and discussions we had about the exhibit afterwards was that over the summer, Duke Gardens has a series of summer camps that they have with younger kids. And because the exhibit was in walking distance from Duke Gardens, when they were doing things on like critical thinking, visual analysis, things like that, they would just walk the kids over to the exhibit and use that exhibit as kind of a teaching tool. And that was something that happened coincidentally. And so now it's something that we're gonna find more purposeful ways to do in the future. Just kind of extending the outreach that can come from doing an exhibit like this. And then we closed with a panel discussion with experts both from the academic side and the private sector about science and art and kind of the ways that they can intersect and then the things that kind of keep these two disciplines from coming together. And so we had Eric Salim, who runs the Fab Lab at NCCU. We had Bob Goldstein, who was the image that I showed you at the beginning of the talk, from UNC Chapel Hill. Sanka Janssen from the biology department here, as well as Heather Gordon, who is a local artist, and Sarah Armstrong, who is actually an I never know how to say that. She takes photos of eyes to help eye doctors diagnose what's going on and share with their patients what's actually happening in their eye. And so we, had a handful of prepared questions for them, but then we really left it to the audience and the things that the audience wanted to know and get out of these different experts' kind of perspectives. And I think one of the big points that kind of got driven home is that none of the people on this panel really thought of themselves as either a scientist or as an artist. They really anchored themselves as both and using principles of both in the different work that they were doing. And so it was really kind of fascinating to have all of them be a part of this, and then to also know that they want to kind of continue being a part of projects like this as they move forward. So Bob last fall taught a science and art collaborative course with an art professor at UNC. And so it's been neat to see the just kind of common thread of combining science and art that's showing up in their own work. And kind of couple last minute things was that we initially, when we started this exhibit and had this idea, this was kind of our, it was 3 graduate students doing this on top of the other work that we did. This was kind of a like pie in the sky idea of like, if we can pull this together, it'll be great. If we get people to care about it, that'll be cool too. And the turnout and reception that we got was really something incredible. In addition to just the people who physically came to be a part of the exhibit and take it in, but also the fact that we got covered by Smithsonian magazine, so we got interviewed by them about this project, and we also ended up doing a radio interview with WUNC about this project as well. And so it kind of let us see that this intersection of science and art is something that people care about, especially right now. And we kind of hit on something that is going to be a good kind of driver forward for just creative thinking in general. And one of the things that I probably loved most about this exhibit, and I tell the story about this little boy every time I talk about it, is the fact that we had this little kid come into one of our family days, the family day on 3D printing, and he was obsessed with marine biology, absolutely obsessed with it. And so he, printed a 3D shark, and while he was waiting for that 3D shark to finish printing, he was showing us the different drawings that he did of different marine life. And his parents were like, they don't want to look at that, like don't, bother them with this, but we obviously wanted to. And they were so incredibly detailed, right? They weren't and he was maybe 5 years old. And his mom was like, he spends his time watching, live feeds of different submarine dives or from aquariums. His favorite thing to watch is Blue Planet. And on one hand, while he is this kind of budding marine biologist, he is also this really incredible artist. And to him, there isn't a distinction between one or the other. And so in having exhibits like this, he now gets to see that he doesn't have to choose down the line to be just a scientist or to be just an artist. He he's actually able to see that he is perfectly fine as he is doing both. And so that was kind of one of the biggest just like distilled moments and takeaways of doing an exhibit like this, and kind of the power behind bringing science and art together with one another. And so if I kind of had to distill the lessons that we got from launching this exhibit for the first time, one is that blending art and science really draws people in. It's something that people are paying attention to, and it really creates a sense of connection with them to each of these disciplines. Two is that artists and scientists really have a lot in common, whereas, generally we think of them as these two very different types of people. When we had all of them in the exhibit together, mixing and mingling with one another, you couldn't tell them apart at all. There are facets of kind of analytic thinking that are based in the way that the artists came up with their pieces and constructed their designs, as well as the creative thinking processes that scientists use when they're coming up with ways to answer the big questions that they're asking. And in general, both of these individuals are working on figuring out ways to describe the world around us using the different modes of thinking that we use that span all of those different kind of areas that I showed before. Last one is that these sorts of collaborations can lead to new ideas. Sometimes scientists might have a problem that an artist might have an answer to. So I had a student in my summer program who, part of the work he was doing was working on ways to build scaffolding to create cartilage to help your knee. If your joints run out of cartilage there, you no longer have any cushion. And he was having trouble figuring out how to create molds for that scaffolding. And if you look to a sculptor or somebody who is working in that media who makes molds all the time to do what they do, they're going to be able to give you some answers or some tips or some ideas so that you can now fix that engineering problem. So by merging these two fields in this way, you actually get this flow of ideas that you wouldn't get otherwise. And then the last thing is that things are better when you get more folks involved. So one of the reasons why we got such a good turnout is because we included people from so many different areas. For every graduate student who was a part of the exhibit as a scientist being a contributor or as an artist themselves, we got their group of friends, their group of lab mates, etc., who came through the exhibit to support them. Similarly with every artist who was a part of it. Similarly for all of the different people that we had on that panel. With Eric being a part of it, we had folks from NCCU. With Bob being a part of it, we had folks from UNC. And so by inviting more people to the table to be a part of this project, we actually got a more connected experience with different communities in the area, which was a really powerful thing. And so I will stop there, and we have about a half hour so that we can discuss, I can answer questions, etc. So, yeah.
Ariana, are you going to do the program again this year?
We are. We're actually in the process, and we're going to open April 5th or April 6th in Golden Belt. So we have our scientists and our artists paired.
Oh, you've already paired them up, and so that's set for the year.
Yeah, but our hope is to keep this going as a yearly exhibit with new scientists and new artists a part of it every year.
So if people want to know more about this year's version, what's the best way to find out, besides joining our listserv?
The Art of a Scientist has a website. I'm pretty sure it's just artofascientist.org, so you can log on to there and then you can use that. And we have Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, the whole social media shebang that you can use to kind of keep tabs on where we are with the exhibit. We're working on doing a series of vignettes of the scientists and the artists who are a part of the exhibit and kind of their own personal stories behind wanting to be a part of the exhibit itself. Ooh, so many hands went up. Ben, and then we can go around the table.
What would you say to a scientist who has aspirations of participating in something like this, but is just completely intimidated, feels like I don't have an artistic bone in my body, I don't want to go near that for whatever reason?
Yeah, so we actually had that a lot, and it was interesting to see people who were like, oh, I would love to do something like this, but I don't feel like I can. And then when they actually stepped into the exhibit, they were like, oh, I should have submitted something to this, I should have been a part of it. And my main go-to when I've had friends who are scientists who are like, I just don't know, is submit it anyways, and you can figure it out as you go. Because they're really, like, with all of the thinking and, problem solving and things like that that a scientist does in the lab, there's nothing to stop you from like applying that same thinking to something that's a more artistic endeavor. And I think sometimes like people sell themselves short. So my suggestion always is just submit something and see where it goes. Because there's, you know, often more behind, like there's more beauty in whatever you've created than we give ourselves credit for. So I have a buddy who, a lot of his work is very mathematical based. And he's like, there's no way I could come up with something. But one of the charts that he makes, they're called Manhattan plots. And they look like a New York skyline. And I'm like, that's art right there. Like it might be this, you know, really complicated mathematical algorithm that you're using to generate it, but that in and of itself is art, and you don't need to do anything more on top of that. Oftentimes we think we have to do more and more and more and more, and generally we don't.
Yeah, I've always been fascinated where the two intersect with like data visualization in general, so I love that you made that point.
Yes, I want to ask a communications question. Is that, you know, how did, I mean, a lot of background work goes into, you know, putting such a together, and, you know, what communication departments did you work with, or how did you go about the logistics? How did you have access to such wonderful people, you know, for the panel, etc., and to a venue like that, and media outlets, etc. And are those resources that others can use if they're sort of arranging or organizing a similar event? For example, there's I'm working on some art for an AI art thing they're doing in the Rubenstein Gallery and stuff like that. So, you know, are there resources that others at Duke, or, you know?
Yeah, so for us, a lot of this just came from us talking to people. Like that's kind of how this exhibit even got legs in the first place. So we had emailed around we had the idea in mind, and then we like emailed around to different galleries, and like it was, you know, things were booked, and then somewhere along the line somebody was like, I can't help you, but you should talk to Bill Fick at the Ruby. And so I sent Bill an email, and he was like, I love this idea, let's talk. And so that kind of sent us off to the races. And between him and then Katie Clune, who is their communications person, she was wonderful at helping us kind of make the different ad materials that we made for the exhibit, that we were then able to use to like send contacts to different areas. We used, for each of us 3 graduate students who were a part of it, we used all of our departmental listservs to like kind of get started at connecting to different peoples, and then all the different organizations or like student groups that we were a part of anyways to kind of get the message out. And through just like personal connections that we had is also how we extended into the artist community too. So I happen to have a friend who was one of the founders of the Carrot, so I sent her an email being like, hey, we have this idea. And so it was really just what are different people that we know already that we can start talking to? And then oftentimes, even if those people, you know, couldn't help it, they were more than happy to pass it along to other folks, which then kind of generated that connection. Bill is who knew Bob at UNC, and so he was like, oh, you should talk to him about this. And that's kind of what, you know, got us started there. We had Contech was one of our sponsors, and so they worked with the artist Heather Gordon, who she did the design on the side of their van. And so that's how we got her to be a part of the student panel too. We had some people contact us just because other people had been talking about the exhibit. I think that's how Sarah ended up being on the panel as well, and Eric too, if I'm not mistaken. But really it was just through opening up the conversation with folks and being like, we have this idea, we think it's really cool, and we're trying to figure out how to give it the best shake it can get for people being there. So, and it was really shocking with the different sponsors that we got. We just kind of cold emailed them being like, this is our idea, this is what we're trying to do. If there's any way you think that we could, you know, you could help or we could help one another, that would be great. And so that's how we ended up getting the Nikon. They sponsored us in addition to them providing their support for one of those family days. And then similarly with Carolina Biological, it's just like, this could be, you know, we use products from them all the time, so this could be a good place to talk to. So yeah, lots of just like thinking of anybody you could, you know, imagine.
Thank you.
I want to jump in. I'm in the news office and I'm interested in your event. When is it happening?
Oh, it's
It's marketing, there's, publicity push is on its way soon, but March 20th has been set as the date.
Oh, okay,
And
okay.
some details for the venue and setting are still being nailed down, but this is being done through the Plus DS initiative, and, you know, we're in the midst of hammering.
So March 20th, yeah, do you have a time?
Evening, it's gonna
Yeah,
be, I
6 to
believe,
8.
6 to 8.
Okay, thanks.
Jory.
Do you have a sense of what's been done here at Duke in the sort of area of art and science and STEAM, and what's in the pipeline? What sorts of, beyond, besides this event, are there other big things coming up?
Yeah, so one of the groups on campus that we actually collaborated with as a part of the exhibit, the engineering school does a series or a kind of image contest every year called Envisioning the Invisible, where they have different engineering students, et cetera, submit images that they have generated, and then they have, like, they, you know, vote on the top 3, and then the top 3 win a prize or something like that. And so that happens every year, and so we worked with them, and we kind of incorporated some of their, like, top pieces as a part of our exhibit too, but that's something that is ongoing. It started as a memoriam for a student who had passed, and they just kind of keep that going in his honor. But there are all sorts of groups kind of across campus that do science and art related things. One of the projects that Jory and I are actually working on now is to do an assessment of all these science and art collaborations that Duke is doing, to kind of get a real notion of what we're thinking about when we think art and science collaborations, what our goals are when we think of art and science collaborations, and so on. But there are groups like Reimagining Medicine that do things like this, and I think I am spacing on the date in April. I think it's April 5th. One of them is doing Ruby Friday talk on the use of puppetry for healthcare and things along, and like communicating in that realm. So there are lots of different projects kind of across the board.
What about beyond Duke? There's a thing coming up in DC that you're going to. in April,
Yeah,
is that right?
so in general, one of the things that the National Academies of Sciences is trying to do right now is re-inject science with the humanities and with the arts. They just released a report about this this past summer, I want to say. And then they're doing a kind of one-day symposium about science-art collaborations and kind of why we should do them and why science needs the arts in general. So it's kind of something that is getting more national attention right now. There are also programs like in Europe and stuff like that that are a little bit more established that kind of are highlighting the importance of the arts for these sorts of things, particularly in the realm of like being able to connect sciences back to the rest of the world. So one of these projects, it's called the Perform Project. And what they're doing is they're getting groups of, like, they're forming these collaborations between scientists, teachers, and then teachers' classrooms to come up with these artistic projects to communicate some sort of research or healthcare related topic. So these have like spanned from like street performances or plays that classes have come up with to communicate some of these more complex and harder to communicate ideas, just to like bring science back to humanity and like connect it better with the rest of society. Yeah.
So this event is awesome, and I work with Casey at the Superfunds Research Center, and I do some of the communications stuff, but also connect graduate students with communications opportunities. So this is fantastic. One of the things that I think I try and do, and doesn't always go well, is to quantify what the impact would be, or to have some kind of summary of what the impact is on public's understanding of science or their feeling of connectedness with science. Have you thought about collecting feedback from people in a formal way or maybe an informal way from this event?
So that's what we're, one of the things that we're working on for this year, because there are a couple different veins that we didn't have the bandwidth to kind of get that information from last year, but we're hoping to start to like build kind of and get that information. So some of them are like, yeah, creating feedback surveys that people who come through the exhibit can like fill out. And like since we had the QR system going last year, we can kind of use that same system again for a like survey that people can just like scan and then go as they're like out the door. And similarly with like the family days that we do, and in talking to the women who run the set of summer camps for Duke, that's another area that we can kind of get some more feedback of like what are the actual effects and potential benefits of having people come through this exhibit. But then another thing that we want to do is actually talk to and interview to get feedback from the scientists and artists who are part of the exhibit to see what they're getting out of this as well, both from the collaboration standpoint of the person that you're working with who is, in a very different discipline than like you claim to be in, and then also from what has being a part of this exhibit, done for you or changed for you if it has like changed your thinking. So it's something that we weren't able to do last year, but we're looking forward to being able to do in years to come.
So as someone who is a science advocate and policy person, but also musician, I've kind of thought about, how music and science can go together, and it seems to be a little, at least to me, seems a little harder because it makes a lot of sense to use art to represent scientific ideas and vice versa, visual art rather, or performances or whatever it is. So I guess I'm curious, was there any, in this exhibit, were there any things that specifically related to music?
Yeah.
Or what other ideas have you had or heard of that people are combining musical performance with communicating science, vice versa?
Yeah. So we had one, and this is slightly different because it was a dance piece, but she, in kind of studying, and I'm trying to think if I have this on here. Yeah, so this piece right here, she actually did traditional Indian dance. And so in learning about the scientific work here, she was very purposeful in using music to combine that with the dance that she did to recapitulate the cell biology process that was going on here. And so there are definitely opportunities where, especially with things of that nature that are kind of a time-lapse thing, which was the nature of the cell biology work that Corey did, where you can use different aspects of music, tempo, volume, things like that, to recapitulate some of those pivotal changing moments, which she did with using the music in the background that she timed to the performance that she did. But I think there were definitely, it wasn't, that was the only piece we had like that last year, but it definitely isn't limited to just doing things along those lines. And so, for example, we find that there are a decent amount of scientists who are in this allotment who are also musicians. So Jonah Singh, for example, who is the scientist who studies the neurocircuitry in birds, he's a drummer, and so oftentimes he will use drumming as his introduction to the kind of learning that he is studying and the circuitry that underlies it. And we had talked about the possibility of using that as a family day activity of teaching kids to drum in different patterns and communicating back and forth the same way that neurons would fire. So there are definitely ways to connect that hopefully we'll continue seeing more of. Yeah.
Along those lines, I've seen some really cool stuff looking at the interface of math and music. I am well versed in neither music theory nor math, so
You don't want to be.
I don't really know, I don't really understand it, but when I read things about these projects that sort of look at the inherent mathematics in art and vice versa, it's really cool stuff. I wish I understood it better, but that might be sort of an area where some of the things having to do with theory and syncopation and stuff like that, there's actual connections to mathematics that exist in nature. Maybe someone in here knows more about it than I do.
But another thing that brought to mind is that there is, and this is related but tangential, but there is kind of an underlying movement of using HipHop to communicate scientific ideas too. So kind of taking scientific principles and then developing kind of either freestyle, rap about it or something along those lines. So people are definitely paying attention to those sorts of things. So it's cool to see art in so many different facets coming to light in this way, whether it's music, dance, visual arts, theater, etc. More thoughts, questions? Do other folks have kind of ideas? Oh yeah, Neva, sorry.
What metrics do you use to figure out like the level of engagement or understanding from your public?
Yeah, so that's something that we'll have to do some like research and digging into to figure out the best ways to capture that. I am not a trained social scientist, so we'll probably consult with some folks who do that to figure out what are the types of survey questions that they use, but then also because of the phrasing of like, the way you form that survey and the different
So are you
answer
doing
choices you
surveys?
get.
Is that your
So that's
metric?
gonna be our, that's gonna be
Okay.
our first pass at doing this. Another to get kind of more qualitative information would be to do interviews. So that's a little bit more difficult to do with just like the public coming in and out of the exhibit, but that is something that we can do with like the, artists and scientists who are part of that exhibit. And since they're having some of these like one-on-one interactions with the folks coming through the exhibit, we can kind of get their take on how they went. But we used surveys before when we've done some of our other outreach events, and got pretty good feedback from that in regards to having these more personal interactions with like scientists doing what they do, making a difference in like what people are taking away after they leave that interaction. So,
When you say personal interactions, do you mean like one-on-one?
one-on-one, like actual conversations with another human being. So I think one of the trends we're seeing a little bit now is that having a more conversational dynamic in your interactions in regards to like just like science communication leaves a better imprint on that person when they go, as opposed to these kind of like impersonal, I'm going to talk at you. Having these two-way interactions is really beneficial.
I'm curious, how did you pair your scientists and artists together? Was it sort of random, or
Yeah.
did you have a more?
So we let the artists choose. So we actually gave all of our scientists the option if they wanted to be paired or if they didn't want to be paired. Because we did have a handful of folks who the science they were presenting was art. One of my lab mates does pencil and pen drawings of the like plants that she studies, because if you're going to identify a new species, then you have to have a detailed kind of representation of that. And so that's what she did, so she didn't feel that it needed to be paired with an artist. And so once we had our collection of scientists who wanted to be paired, we had them send us a like description of their work and what they did, and then we worked with them to like make that description something that was like easily accessible language. And then we put it all together in a booklet and we sent it to our artists and asked them to give us their top 3 choices for what piece they wanted to be with. And then we tried to give everybody their top choice for as many as we could. And then we just sent emails pairing, like with the hey, you two, you've been paired with one another for this exhibit. You can now contact each other in whatever medium you want to contact each other in and kind of take this from there. So yeah, we gave especially with different types of medium, the different types of media the artists were using, we felt that it was beneficial to kind of give them the choice of what they felt would be most kind of appropriate or like impassioned for them to work on. We had one woman who worked in fused glass and she got paired with a cell biologist, and the pieces that she made were really remarkable. Yeah.
Well, I was delighted that you projected a slide by Leonardo da Vinci because, as you may know, this is the 500th year of his death.
Oh.
And there's going to be a tremendous number of activities in Europe, also in the United States, at different centers, celebrating the quintessential genius. So what I was going to say is that one of the very interesting things about what you're showing here is 2 things. First of all, most human beings have some creativity potential. That doesn't mean they are creative, but they have the potential. But if you're going to look at the intersection of science and art at its best, they're both very creative activities. However, one of the great puzzles that at least up to now has never been solved is what is the nature of creativity and how does the brain do it? And most people, artists, scientists, if you ask them, well, how did you get to this point? The uniform answer is, I don't know.
Yep.
And the question is, can we now say, well, no, that's not a good answer. What are the ways in which you can approach a question? And you can go to evolutionary biology and ask a simple question. Well, how does the brain of an ape, non-human primate, have cognition? Where did he get it from? Can he do things that are creative, like use tools or whatever, lie, okay? There's a creativity lying to his advantage, or whatever, the alpha male getting all the females, but other juvenile males sneaking in, getting some of the females when he's doing something different. So now my question is, have you thought of having collaborative projects with your students and the faculty to question, coming back to the question, what is the nature of creativity in whatever they're doing, whether it's science, or whether it's art, whether it's painting, whatever.
Yeah, no, that's an awesome question. And I wish I had a better answer to give you, but it is something that I think about pretty regularly. And I actually had, I was giving a talk at the Ruby about this exhibit, and afterwards I got to talking with Scott Lindroth, who is a musician by trade, about the fact that we kind of pin people in these boxes, or we, sometimes phrase like bringing science and art together as a means of like using art for science communication, which like isn't the goal of something like this, right? We want to appreciate the creative processes that are going on in either vein, and really what you're promoting here is that notion of creative thinking, because creative thinking is what is underlying both of these things. And so kind of getting at the nature of what does it mean to be creative? What is it, is it something that can be like practiced and learned and developed over time? Is it something that you do just have to be like gifted with and then it moves on from there? And I do think a lot of it does have to do with the nature of whether or not you decide to be like dedicated to doing a particular thing. And just developing that kind of skill set over and over and over again, because as you start building that skill set for yourself, then you start having the freedom to be able to combine things that maybe you couldn't combine before because you didn't have the ability to. And so I think there's still a ton to learn in that area. I think it's something that people are like fascinated by. I think you see it, I mean, even in regards to, and like this is, way like left field, but like in looking at sports science and things like that and learning it, like how do these athletes do these things that they do, right? And a lot of that comes from, it's a combination of all these different facets of their physicality on one hand, and then also them learning to do these things and continually doing them over and over again, and just getting kind of a body memory for it. And so it kind of encompasses all of these different notions, and I think I don't know if we're any closer to getting that answer, but maybe one day we will be. More questions, thoughts?
How did you initially get scientists involved in the exhibit last year for the first time? Because I assume now people kind of know about it and they're submitting, abstracts or something, but how did that happen?
So it just started with us sending out emails with like a Google form for folks to fill out to different departments that we were a part of, and then nudging folks that we were like, you would be great to do this, so you should sign up to do this, and then encouraging them to share it with other folks as well. So it was interesting. I think we all felt that it would be like more difficult to get people to want to participate in it, and we did have some folks that kind of greeted it with hesitation, but then we had those brave folks that were like, yeah, like why not? And we got a lot of questions of people being like, well, what sorts of pieces can I submit? And we're like, anything. And so we've definitely gotten a wider diversity of folks now that we've done the first show, because before it very much was people in our departments that we had, some sort of personal connection to. So it's nice to see it actually kind of varying it up and people just wanting to be involved for the sake of being involved. So.
It's really nice to see that you guys reached out to all your networks and connected everyone, and it really helped spread the event and whatnot. What would you recommend for people who don't have these networks, people who are first-year students who've moved far from home or they're international? Do they just spray and pray, hope someone has gotten some interest?
Yeah. So kind of similarly to, I'm trying to remember. I think somebody asked a question that was along the same before, but talk to somebody about the idea that you have, because a large part of this, especially in getting people to participate beyond our home departments, was in talking to people who thought the idea was like awesome, who could then send that message to somebody else. So getting, you know, connected with Katie at the Ruby was instrumental in getting all of the folks that she, you know, knew and like had connections to. You know, I talked to Jory about it, and then he connected me to different groups that he knew on campus and elsewhere that would also be interested in this. So just making the choice to talk to somebody about the idea you have, and you'll be interested to see how willing I think people are to like help you develop that idea. And especially like, again, with some folks it was like I can't help you with this in like XYZ ways, but I can help you this way, or I can connect you to this person or something along those lines. And like we had that happen with the Carrick. Initially we had contacted them to potentially like house the exhibit there because we wanted it to be somewhere in like the Durham community to like really like get that community involved. And it didn't work for us to have that exhibit there, but the woman at the Carrick was like, we'd be more than happy to share this with our artists that come through here, since you want artists involved in this exhibit. And so that opened a huge door to get local artists involved in the project as well. Similarly, when like Casey contacted the Durham Art Council, and it was like, well, we might not be able to like give you funding or help you in these ways, but we can share it to our community. And so even if you yourself don't have a network, looking up the different like places in the area that are relevant to what you're trying to do and just sending them an email, and then developing a correspondence with them. And a lot of the things that we got down the line came from doing that. That's how we ended up with the, you know, getting the gallery space at the Ruby, was because we kept getting pinged from all the different galleries in the area that we had emailed because things were filling up. And then eventually they were like, you should talk to Bill. So yeah, generally people are very quick to, if they can't help themselves, refer you to somebody else that they know that's interested in the same things you are.
And if you're interested in anything that's sort of at the interface of science and society, science communication, science policy, bioethics, that's what we do here at the Duke Initiative for Science and Society. So come talk to us, and you know, we're always looking for new creative ways to collaborate with other groups on campus. And you know, there may be ways that we can work together or try to support some ideas that you have. The other group, if you don't know about them, that's on campus that I absolutely love is the Forum for Scholars and Publics, which does a lot of really cool things at the interface of science and the arts and culture and society. You can just, if you just Google Duke FSP for Forum, what is it?
Forum
for Scholars and Publics. It's the first hit that comes up, and everybody should be on their email list. I don't get paid to say this, but they're just awesome. So they do really, really cool things as well on campus.
Yeah, and like that was another, so that was one of the contacts that like Jory gave me, and then talking to them, it was like we are more than happy to share this with our listserv. And like similarly with like the family days, we had that moment of like, how are we gonna get the word out to like parents who have children, because the bulk of us who are a part of this aren't actually parents who have children. And so through the other organizations we worked with, the folks at Contact, because the people who are employed there are, you know, parents that have kids, he was like, we have connections with the Durham Public Schools, and we can, you know, put this on their, you know, flyer that they send around to folks. The Duke Durham Neighborhood Partnership was another good office. It was like the purpose of this office is to connect Duke activities with the, you know, neighborhoods in Durham, including the different school systems here. So really not being afraid to like contact folks that you feel would be a good connection to develop is, yeah, was the way it all happened. So, awesome. Any lingering questions or thoughts? Cool. So I'll just end, oh, this is further back than I thought. With just a reminder for the next session that we have coming up with Nalini Nadkarni, who is going to be discussing her project of sustainability in prison. So that'll be March 19th from 12 to 1. So, all right. Thank you all for coming out today.